Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible teacher and cultural analyst, and today we're going to follow up on a video I did previously on the Menendez brothers documentary on Netflix that I have had the opportunity now to go through all 9 episodes, and I've been able to verify whether my initial reaction to the Netflix docuseries was accurate, and I have to say that it was accurate. The verdict in the second trial, they had 2 trials. The first trial was a hung jury, a mistrial, and then the second trial was a conviction, life imprisonment without parole to both of the brothers. So if you're not familiar with the story, these 2 brothers in California murdered their parents brutally, cold-blooded killing, using shotguns by basically emptying out the shotgun shells into their parents in their living room while they were watching television. And these 2 brothers then stood trial for murder, and it looked like a fairly cut and dry trial because there were tons of evidence against these brothers, and it just looked like a matter of whether they would get the death penalty or life imprisonment. And then they hired a defense lawyer, Leslie Abramson, and she was known for being able to pull out a self-defense plea through basically turning the perpetrators, these 2 boys, into victims by recalling from their childhood the sexual abuse by their father. And so she was able to sway the first jury, the first trial jury, to basically a hung jury. So there was no conclusion there. Now, the second trial, they did not permit the testimony and as much testimony, and they didn't permit as much of the sexual abuse testimony and evidence. And so they've basically focused on what these 2 boys did. And there's no question they murdered their parents, and there's no question they premeditatedly did so. And there's no question in my mind, and I don't believe there should be in anyone's mind, that they are guilty of first-degree murder and that they should be locked up all their life, or under a strictly biblical justice system, they would have actually received the death penalty, because it says in Genesis 9:6, it says, if you shed the blood of anyone, your blood shall be shed in response. So the death penalty is just mapped out there, plain as day, and that is basically the idea that the Christian West for 2,000 years or more has followed, that if you commit capital punishment, you will pay with your life. And that is the assumption and operating principle for most of the Christian West for 2,000 years. Now, recently, there has been a softening of that, and then the states are allowed to abolish the death penalty, and there's a big movement by activist groups to abolish the death penalty, but there is no universal abandonment of the death penalty in the United States. Now the separate states can do so, and there has been a weakening of the principle that if you shed someone's blood, your blood will be shed in response. There's been a weakening of that, and we've seen how that detrimental effect has acted out in society. We're seeing murders and crimes taking place now. A lot of the people that kill other people are let go, a loosening, a weakening, a liberalizing of criminals in our society, and that has spelled disaster pretty much. But in California, back in the 90s, early 90s, they found these 2 boys guilty of first-degree murder. And that is the way it should be. I was reacting against a Christian podcaster, Becket Cook, who also called for the release of these 2 boys. Now, even though he knew that they had killed their parents, even though he knew that they had done so in cold blood, in a brutal, bloody way, even though all the evidence was stacked against them, He thinks, like Kim Kardashian and some of the celebrity Hollywood types, that these two boys have paid enough and that they've suffered enough in prison and they should be allowed to go scot-free now. The problem with that is that it is not Christian and it's not biblical and it's not any kind of principled understanding of the situation. It is an emotional reaction to these boys' testimony that they were abused. Now, here's something that I took away from viewing the entire docuseries, and that is the testimony of these boys is somewhat suspect. Now, I will not go as far as saying what the prosecutor did in the second trial, and that is his claim was that they made all of this up. He held up a book to the jurists and he said, this book outlines all of the different types of abuse that can be used to try to sway a jury, and these boys used all of those defenses. And he said they made up the whole abuse plea and defense. They made it all up. Now, I don't go that far to say that they made it all up. We do know that the older son, he was a manipulator. And it brought that out in the docuseries, that he is a manipulator, he's a liar, and so is the younger son. They both were caught in lies. They both were caught in situations where they were describing how they were trying to manipulate the jury and how that in cahoots with their lawyer, this Leslie Abramson, they were mapping out a strategy as to how to use the tears and the crying and the emotional aspect of the abuse testimony to their favor, to win the sympathy and empathy of the jurists. They talked about that. They discussed it. They knew what they had to do. And the lawyer also coached them as to how to not be cold and not be emotionless, but to actually play up the defense of sexual abuse in their favor to get them off of the murder charges, to try to somehow convince the jury that they were justified in premeditating and murdering their parents in cold blood using shotguns and blowing them away. She tried to coach them into how to use the self-defense of victimhood of abuse to try to get the sympathy of the jurors to let them go free and somehow justify their brutal murders. And that was her strategy. And she had used that, their lawyer that the family hired to defend these boys, had used that strategy before with success in the court system. She had gotten a murderer off the death sentence and out of jail through the use of this self-defense of a victim of abuse. And she had been successful in doing that. And so she was bringing that defense into the Menendez trial. And she was hoping that it would work. And it actually did work in the first trial, because the older son got on the witness stand and basically did this emotional, tear-jerking, gut-wrenching, heart-wrenching testimony that was really powerful. I mean, the way he described the abuse that took place in his life by his father, what his father put him through, the terrible things that the father did to him as a boy, and then also continued to do with the other son, the sexual abuse, the simply outrageous things that this father was doing. If the testimony of the boys is accurate, then this father is actually a monster and deserves to be locked up in prison. Of course, he's dead now, but he deserved to be locked up in prison. And the justice system should have grabbed him and taken him and locked him up. But again, the question is, were these boys lying? Now, it is my opinion, having looked at the case, that they were not totally lying, but then they weren't totally being honest. So, in other words, They were told by their lawyer to play up their victimhood and their sexual abuse experiences so that the jury would shift the focus from what the terrible, awful, brutal murders that they did, shift that focus off of that and shift it onto the father and make him the perpetrator, make him the bad guy, make him the monster, and get the jury thinking in terms of this father is on trial, not the boys. And so you try to shift the blame from the boys in killing the parents to the father who supposedly pushed them to the brink and shoved them in the direction of murdering himself and the mother at the same time. So the defense strategy, Leslie Abramson's defense strategy, was to try to gain the sympathy of the jurors and get them off the murder charges using the defense of sexual abuse. And the first trial, she actually almost did it, except it was a tie. So the jurors tied, and it was a hung jury, mistrial, and so they had to do it all over again. But the second time, the court system did not allow them to play up the sexual abuse victimhood defense. They were simply going to stick with the facts of what happened, what did the boys do, what were the facts that proved that they did this, and then what was the penalty, the sentence and the penalty. And so they did away with all the emotional testimony. They did away with all of the shifting of the focus from the boys and their crime to the father and his alleged crime. Now, again, I do not doubt that these boys went through something in their childhood, and even up to the youngest boy, even up to just a few weeks before the actual murders. So he was being abused supposedly from childhood all the way up until young adulthood. And the older boy, though, was abused when he was a child for a few years, but then he protested enough that his father stopped doing these sexual abuse acts on him and shifted to the younger boy. Okay, I don't doubt that something happened in their family. You think about the 60s and the sexual revolution and all of the sexual immorality that came into the culture, and the floodgates opened up. So there are all kinds of people who have had sexual abuse in their past as children, whether it's from family members or neighbors or acquaintances. We know, for example, in the Catholic Church, there was sexual abuse happening by the priests to these altar boys and all kinds of sexual abuse there. So there's no doubt that after the sexual revolution of the 60s and the floodgates opened of all the immorality and loose morality, a lot of these things began to come into the culture, and no doubt a lot of people are walking around with scars and damages and injuries due to sexual abuse. Now, these brothers probably did go through some kind of sexual abuse, and it could have been how long, who knows, and of what type, who knows, because again, it's a proven fact that these boys are manipulators and they're liars. But that doesn't mean that everything they said on the witness stand was false. There could have been, at core, some kind of abuse, and it could have gone on for some time. Again, it's hard to know when you're a liar. It's like the boy that cried wolf. If you cry wolf and there's no wolf, and you lie to the townspeople, then when there really is a wolf, nobody's going to believe you. And so the prosecutor in the second trial argued that these boys totally made up the sexual abuse charges, and the father was an upstanding citizen and so forth. I don't say that, and I don't believe that. And he was trying to drive home the point that these guys were lying, and that they were shown in lies. So if you can't really believe their testimony, his argument was you can't really believe their arguments and their testimonies because we know they're lying sometimes, so we don't know when they're lying and when they're telling the truth. So he claimed that they were lying about the whole abuse thing. I don't believe that. I believe they were sexually abused. I believe their father was a bad man. But that doesn't change the fact that they don't have the right in a civilized society operating on the principles of morality to go in and kill their parents. And I've explained before in other videos that they were not in direct face-to-face confrontation with a threat at the time of the murders. They were not facing grave danger at that very moment. And coupled with the fact that it's hard to know how much of the abuse testimony is true and how much is false, and to what extent they actually were abused, that's hard to know. You cannot let them go and get off on these murder charges. What happened in the O.J. trial, which was something before the conclusion of their trial, was that O.J. Simpson was clearly guilty of a double homicide. There's no question about that. But see, Johnny Cochran and all of the high-paid lawyers that were hired by O.J. to get him off the hook, they, again, shifted the focus of the trial from O.J. and his guilty, bloody hands in murdering these two people. They shifted the focus from O.J. and his crime to the LAPD and racism of a cop, one or two cops. So in other words, instead of being about whether O.J. did this or not, this murder, these double murders, the focus of the trial was allowed to shift to the entire LA police department and racism in the police department. That's totally insane. So the trial is about O.J., but all of a sudden it becomes about the LAPD. And these lawyers, these defense lawyers, were brilliant in the fact that they were able to shift the focus away from O.J., and lo and behold, he gets off scot-free. He walks a free man, even though he killed two people. And everybody today, everybody, no matter what community you're in, the United States, whether you're in the black community in LA or wherever you're at, everybody understands that O.J. Simpson killed these two people. But because of the politicalization of the trial and the shifting of the focus from O.J. to the police department, O.J. was able to walk scot-free. Well, the lawyers in the second Menendez brothers trials did not let that happen. They focused on the actual crime that took place, and they showed that these brothers were guilty of that and that they deserved to be punished for that crime, and that even if they were abused, that does not justify the violent murdering of their parents. And that is exactly correct. So there should have never been any Christian commentators or Christian theologians or thinkers or Christian leaders calling for the release of these Menendez brothers. Under the biblical paradigm, they should have actually been given the capital punishment after their trial and after their guilty verdict. That should have happened, but it wasn't. So they were given life imprisonment, and okay, that's what they have to serve. That's the payment for their crimes of killing their parents. And just because people believe the abuse testimony that they gave does not justify them being released. They committed a terrible crime. They have to pay a terrible time in prison. And just because there are sympathizers for their situation with their father does not mean that they get off and get to go free. Now, there's another aspect of this that I want to talk about, and that is it showed after the first trial, it showed that the lawyer for their lawyer, the woman Leslie Abramson, gathered the women jurist in that first trial and placed a call to the younger Menendez brother and said that the women were all with him and believed him, and they got together as met together in the home of Leslie Abramson and gave a call to the prison with the younger son, brother. And they said, we stand with you and we believe you that you were abused. And they said, our maternal instincts kicked in and we really sympathize with you and we don't think you should have to go to jail. The problem was all the men of the jury didn't buy it. And they could see through Leslie Abrams, the defense lawyer, her tactic to try to pull and tug at the heartstrings of people to get the sympathy that they needed to get these boys off this murder charge. And so the men didn't buy that. They saw through it and they voted for a conviction. The women, on the other hand, voted for acquittal. And so it was a tie. It was a hung jury. So they had to do a second trial. And in the second trial, there was no tie. It was clear that the majority wanted these boys to pay for their crimes with jail time and life imprisonment because of the nature of what they did, and regardless of what kind of abuse they had to go through. So I thought that was brought out really well in the docuseries, and I really don't see how anyone can watch the documentary series and come away with it thinking, oh yeah, no question, those boys need to be released. The only way you can come up with that conclusion is, again, if you allow yourself to be swayed by the emotional nature of the testimony that they gave about the abuse. Now, there is some new evidence that may shed some more light on Jose Menendez, and that is there are a couple now testimonies and witnesses that say that they were abused by Jose Menendez. So that would lend more credence to the testimony of these two boys. It would lend more credence to the fact that they were in fact abused. Because again, in the second trial, the prosecutors were basically arguing that the boys made the whole thing up because the only evidence that there was that this Jose Menendez, their father, had done all these terrible things was the testimony of the boy, the son, the younger one and the older one, and that it was then in their best interest to try to testify that he had done bad things to them, and he had done a lot of it and terrible things and go into graphic details. And so it was in their best interest to play up the abuse. So what this quote, new evidence that people are pointing to today is that there are one or two people who are willing to testify that Jose Menendez had either abused them or attempted to sexually abuse them. And that would then lend credibility to the boys' testimonies in the trials that, yes, indeed, this abuse occurred. And again, for me, I don't question the fact that this father was a monster and he really did do bad things to the boys. I don't question that. I believe that under all of the maybe fabrications and exaggerations and the playing up of the abuse, I believe underneath all of that there actually was some kind of abuse taking place in the Menendez family, and that both of these boys probably did suffer to some degree some sexual abuse, and it could have been a longer period of time. It could have been a shorter period of time. Again, we don't know because we can't really trust the credibility of the testimony that these boys give, because it is shown over and over and again that they tried to manipulate people. They tried to tell people things that were not true. They tried to tamper with witnesses. They actually tried calling people and saying, are you willing to testify that you saw my father or heard my father abuse me and do this and that and all of this? They were trying to set up and manipulate the testimony of people, friends of theirs. And so we know that they were willing to go as far as manipulate testimony. We know that they were willing to go as far as embellish and lie and exaggerate to try to get the jury to sympathize with their situation and hopefully let them off. So we know that that was happening. So it's really hard to know how much abuse they really had to go through and how much of this tale that their father was this monster and he was really assaulting them a lot and was manipulative and controlling in their life, and that they were afraid of him and that they were afraid that he might kill them. One of the defenses that they had that their lawyer, Leslie Abrahamson, was putting forth was that the days leading up to the murders, the boys were afraid for their own lives because they were afraid that their parents would kill them and that Jose would actually take their life or kill them because they claim he's threatened their life. He claimed that they said that if they told anyone about what he had done to them, that they would pay with their life, that he'd kill them, and so on and so forth. So again, all of this comes from the brothers. So how much of this do you believe and how much do you not believe? But I think the second trial really brought clarity because it boils down to the fact, no matter what they had to go through, no matter what kind of abuse they had to go through, whether it was a small amount or actually a lot, whether it was just a one-time thing or a couple times thing, or whether it was ongoing, no matter what, that does not give them the right as the sons to murder their parents. It does not give them that right. And nothing in the Christian scripture, nothing in the Bible, nothing in Christian tradition would give them justification for doing what they did or give them justification for walking free even today. So Christians, commentators, podcasters, cultural analysts, intellectuals, thinkers, activists, Christian leaders who are calling for these boys to be released after these 30-some years, there's nothing in the Christian testimony that would justify that call for their release. And there is everything that would say they did a crime, they did a terrible crime, they committed a double murder, they're both guilty. Under normal circumstances, they would have got the death penalty shortly after the verdict was in, and that would have been the end of it. But because they didn't get the death penalty and because they got life imprisonment without parole, that is appropriate because, one, you want to send a signal to society that you cannot do this deed, this dirty, brutal, awful, murderous deed, killing your own parents in cold blood and with shotguns and pumping their bodies, blowing their head off with a shotgun, premeditated murder. You can't do that and just think that you're going to walk away for whatever reason, for whatever justification. There is no justification for that. The only, again, what I said before was the only justification for a violent death like that would be if the father were trying to rape them or sexually assault them in that time, at that very time, and they grabbed a gun and shot the father. That could be argued self-defense. But what they did, they were not under duress. They were not under direct physical threat. And so they premeditatedly killed their parents. And that is not allowable. And that's not allowable in a biblical sense, and that's not allowable in a civilized society. So that was brought out in the documentary, and I think it's pretty accurate that to say they should not be released today, some 30 years later. Well, I hope that's been helpful, but we'll see you back next week on another program. God bless.